What happens when your wife asks for a year off to be with another man? One husband's fight for his life and sanity begins now. You won't believe how this ends. High school romances usually last about 2 months. Well, Rachel Adams and Daniel Taylor broke that record by about 35 years. They met when she was just a junior, and he was a senior at Henderson High School in Chicago. And from that moment on, they were inseparable. They had that true storybook love that seems to stand the test of time. I thought we were really happy. Our marriage was solid, and when Rachel gave birth to our daughter Sophia, it brought us even closer, I said. Those were the years when I felt like the luckiest man in the world. But let me back up and introduce myself. My name is David Grant, and Rachel has been my wife for the last 29 years. We got married when she was 23 and I was 26, but it all started with her high school romance with Daniel. Rachel and Daniel dated all through high school. Yes, she even lost her virginity to him, something she never shied away from mentioning in our marriage. It's no secret that high school romances end eventually, but in their case, it was more like a long pause rather than an end. Daniel was a year older than Rachel and had big plans after graduation. He wanted to make a lot of money and come back to marry her. That's what she told me, often. After graduating from Henderson High, Daniel took a job on an oil rig in Alaska with his uncle. That's where the trouble began. He stopped writing not long after arriving there, leaving Rachel alone during her senior year of high school. Eventually, she started dating another guy, Eric. Or was it Brian? It didn't matter because she never got serious with anyone else. Her heart, as she told me, still belonged to Daniel. Rachel waited, like the loyal girl she always was. But Daniel was nowhere to be found. He thrived on the rig, and loved the rough, nomadic lifestyle, somehow convinced that his sweetheart would still be waiting for him when he returned with pockets full of money. Well, life has a way of moving on, and so did Rachel. She went to college, earned her degree, and met me at a friend's wedding when she was 24 years old. I was 27 at the time, just a couple of years older than her, and I fell for her instantly. It was one of those moments when everything seems perfect. Our marriage was normal, happy even. The only hiccup. 3 days before our wedding, a letter from Daniel arrived. Like some long-lost wanderer, he was finally coming home and wanted Rachel to meet him. I still thank God for her mother, who stepped in and convinced her to stay the course, telling her, "You have a life ahead of you with David. Don't waste it on Daniel." After some emotional moments, where I was genuinely afraid Rachel might call off the wedding, she finally went through with it. We were married, and she became Mrs. Rachel Grant. By the time Daniel finally showed up, it was too late. We were already on our honeymoon. He disappeared again soon after, this time enlisting in the U.S. Navy, far away from the life Rachel had built with me. After we returned from our honeymoon, life settled into a rhythm. Rachel became a nurse, and I started working as a financial advisor for a medium-sized firm in Chicago. My job wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, and we lived comfortably. Our marriage felt strong, or at least I thought it was. There was, however, one small but persistent issue that kept coming up: Daniel. He had started reaching out to Rachel again, first through email, and then through text messages. When I asked if that was necessary, Rachel would wave it off, saying, "Oh, David, don't be jealous. He's just an old friend who needs someone to talk to. He's single and in the Navy, and sometimes he just feels lonely." I wasn't entirely clueless. I knew they were in regular contact. She wasn't hiding anything, but it still made me uncomfortable. Neither her family nor I could convince her to stop, until one day we received news that Daniel had married someone he met overseas. That finally brought a stop to their correspondence, and for the first time in years, I felt a real sense of peace. The next 3 years passed in a blur of happiness. During this time, our daughter Sophia was born. With a baby in our lives, Rachel and I became closer, working hard to build a future for our child. We bought a modest house in the suburbs, one with a big backyard where Sophia could play. Life felt good again. We were a team, and for a while, I thought we had left the past behind us. But as always happens, life threw us another curveball. One day, out of the blue, Rachel received a letter from Daniel. She never mentioned it, but I noticed an increase in our mail. The frequency of stamps and envelopes from the Navy was too telling to ignore. I tried to convince myself it didn't matter. After all, he was miles away, and I had a family to protect. But deep down, I knew better. Eventually, Rachel began casually sharing bits of information she was receiving from Daniel. He had divorced his wife, but had remarried again. He'd seen combat and was awarded several medals for bravery. I would nod, half listening, but inside, I could sense her pride in her Navy man, as she affectionately referred to him. Navy, I'd remind her gently, not Army. He's not a soldier. She'd giggle, as if that made it all better. Watching her talk about him made me uneasy, but I kept hoping she would eventually forget him for good. That hope, however, was misplaced. Daniel had served in the Navy for nearly 30 years, had been married and divorced 3 times, and had enough medals to rival a general. Over time, while Daniel grew more idealized in Rachel's mind, I only seemed to grow older, more predictable. I began to worry more and more. When Daniel retired from the Navy, I prayed he would move somewhere far away, somewhere where his presence wouldn't disturb the life we had built. Unfortunately, that wasn't to be. Sophia, our daughter, was now all grown up and married to a wonderful man named Ethan Scott. They had settled down in Philadelphia, and the exciting news was that they were expecting their first child. I was looking forward to becoming a grandfather. I was 43 at the time, and Rachel was 41, both of us nearing a new chapter in our lives. The idea of retirement was starting to appeal to me. Just a few more years, and I could relax and enjoy life with Rachel. Little did I know, the peace I was dreaming of was about to be shattered. It all started one Thursday evening when I came home from work and found Rachel dressed to the nines, telling me we had a dinner reservation at 7. My first thought was that I must have forgotten an anniversary or birthday, but after racking my brain, I realized I hadn't missed anything important. I decided to play along, cleaned up, and did my best to look presentable. Though next to Rachel, who looked stunning, I still felt out of place. We went to a beautiful Italian restaurant called La Trattoria in downtown Chicago, one of those cozy, dimly lit places that Rachel had always loved. The food was fantastic, and the atmosphere was perfect, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As we neared the end of the meal, I looked at her and said, "All right, Rachel, what's going on? You don't get dressed up like this for just any dinner. Drop the bomb, I won't make a scene." One of my quirks, something I had perfected in my job, was never showing anger or frustration in public. Working as a financial advisor, you learn to stay calm, no matter how stressful the situation is, and that habit had spilled over into my personal life. Rachel knew this too, which was why she often chose public places to tell me things she thought might upset me. I had learned to read her like a book after 29 years of marriage, and tonight, something was definitely wrong. Finally, with a hesitant look on her face, Rachel delivered the news. "David, I think you should know. Daniel is back." Suddenly, I felt nauseous, but I knew it wasn't the food. I stared at her, waiting for her to continue, but Rachel just looked at me, unsure of how to proceed. Finally, I broke the silence. "When you say back, do you mean he's here on vacation?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She shook her head. "No, David. He's not on vacation. He was discharged from the Navy, and he bought a house 2 streets away from us." My heart started to race, but I pressed on. "And is he living there with his 3rd wife?" Again, she shook her head. "No. He's divorced again. He lost part of his pension because of it." I could feel my anger rising, but I tried to suppress it. "Crap," I muttered, maybe a little too loudly. A few of the diners around us glanced in my direction. My frustration wasn't about Daniel losing his pension. It was about the fact that he had moved so close to us. I needed to understand why. "Rachel," I said, my voice growing firmer. "You haven't met with him, have you?" Her face gave her away before she even had a chance to answer. She looked down, avoiding my gaze, and didn't respond. I could feel my stomach churn as I asked the next question, my voice tight with fear. "Did you sleep with him?" Rachel's expression was all the confirmation I needed before she finally spoke. I did, David. But it's not what you think. I glared at her, my voice low and filled with anger. I think my wife slept with another man, Rachel. Now explain to me how it's not what I think it is. She began to cry. He needed me, David. He was going through a really rough time with his divorce, and he looked so lost. I love you, but I realized I still love him too. My heart sank. My wife had slept with Daniel, and he had used his personal crises to worm his way back into her heart and her bed. I looked her straight in the eyes and said, with as much authority as I could muster, Rachel, the damage is done, but we can fix this. We can get our lives back on track, but you can never see him again. You understand me? With tears in her eyes, Rachel shook her head and replied, I can't promise that, David. I love him, and he needs me even more than you do. I was stunned, hearing those words from the woman I had been married to for nearly 3 decades. But I knew better than to react in the middle of a crowded restaurant. I called the waiter over and asked for the check. 10 minutes later, we were in the car, driving home in complete silence. Once we got back to the house, I couldn't hold back any longer. Rachel, I said, how can you possibly sleep with him knowing you're married to me? Have you forgotten the vows we made nearly 29 years ago? The part about forsaking all others? She broke down in tears, sobbing uncontrollably. I'm so sorry, David, I really am. But Daniel needs me, and we've reconnected. I can't bear the thought of losing him or you. I was at a loss for words. What could I possibly say to that? Finally, with frustration and anger bubbling up inside me, I asked, So what do you suggest, Rachel? Should we split our time? He gets you for New Year's, and I get you for Christmas? This isn't a situation where you can have both of us. Rachel stopped crying and looked at me with a strange expression, like she had already made up her mind. How about a vacation, David? I stared at her in disbelief. What the hell are you talking about? She shifted in her seat and spoke more calmly now, as if her suggestion was perfectly reasonable. Remember about 19 years ago, when you took a year off from work to go back to school and get your MBA? You took that time, got your degree, and came back, and everything went back to normal. Well, I missed out on my last year with Daniel. I need this time, David. I need a year. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Rachel, how can you possibly compare me going back to school for a degree that benefited our family to you sleeping with another man? This benefits no one but you and him. I pulled into the driveway and turned off the car. Rachel reached out and touched my face gently, as if that could make everything better. David, I missed out on that final year with Daniel. If we'd had that time, we wouldn't be in this situation today. Please give me this year with him. I promise that once it's over, I'll come back to you, and I'll be the best wife you've ever had. I sat there in silence, feeling like the world was crashing down around me. I couldn't believe what she was asking for. A year with another man. I wanted to scream at her, tell her she was crazy, but instead, I took a deep breath and tried to remain calm. Okay, Rachel, I finally said. If this is what you want, go ahead. But let's get one thing straight. I don't approve of this, and I don't want to see you or hear from you during that year. Is that clear? And don't be surprised if when this year is over, you have no one to come back to. I hoped my words would make her reconsider, but it was as if she didn't hear a word I said. She leaned over and kissed me on the cheek, whispering, Thank you, David. You won't regret this. I shook my head and muttered, It's too late. I already regret it. That night, she wanted to make love to me, but I couldn't do it. The thought of her with Daniel made me sick. I grabbed a pillow, told her I'd be sleeping in the guest room, and left without another word. I saw the hurt in her eyes, but part of me was glad. It was about time she started feeling the consequences of her actions. The next morning, I woke up hoping that last night had been a nightmare. But when I walked into the kitchen, Rachel was there, happily making breakfast, a radiant smile on her face. It was as if she was thrilled by the decision we'd made. She pointed to the calendar on the wall, where she had drawn a thick black line around today's date, April 5th. I sat down at the table, staring at the date. It felt ironic. Today, I was losing my wife, the woman I had been with for nearly 30 years, and she was celebrating it like some kind of victory. "David," she said, placing a plate of pancakes in front of me. "I know you're worried, but in a year I'll be back, and I'll be yours forever. I really need this time to figure things out, and I promise you won't regret it." I stared at her in disbelief. "Rachel, you don't have to do this. You have time to change your mind. Please don't throw everything we've built away for some fantasy about your high school sweetheart." But she just smiled, completely unfazed. "I know what I'm doing, David. I called Daniel this morning while you were still asleep. He's going to pick me up in an hour." My heart sank. I knew then that there was no turning back. I gave it one last shot. "Rachel, don't do this. You're gambling everything for a man you haven't really known in decades. What makes you think this will end well?" She smiled at me, as if I was the one who didn't understand the world. "David, you love me. I know you do. That's why you're giving me this time. Trust me. I'll come back, and everything will be fine." With that, she walked out of the kitchen to finish packing, leaving me to sit there, staring at my uneaten breakfast and wondering how my life had come to this. I forced myself to finish the tasteless breakfast and went upstairs to get dressed. When I entered our bedroom, I saw that Rachel had packed 3 large suitcases filled with her clothes and personal items. She turned to me with a hopeful smile. "I think I have everything I need. Can you help me carry these down to the porch for Daniel?" I looked at her blankly for a moment, then replied coldly, "No." Her face fell in shock. "What do you mean, no?" I crossed my arms. "If you're determined to throw away 29 years of marriage, then you and Daniel can carry your own bags. I'm not going to help you get into bed with him. You understand me?" Rachel stared at me, stunned and hurt. "David, Daniel isn't a jerk. He's a wonderful man and a hero who served our country. What are you doing?" I turned away, muttering under my breath. "Yeah, he got medals, 3 square meals a day, and got to travel the world while I stayed here and worked to support you and Sophia. So, you're right. I didn't do anything." Rachel shot me a dirty look and began dragging her suitcases downstairs by herself. A few minutes later, a car pulled up in front of our house, and I saw Daniel get out to help load her things. He hadn't changed much over the years, still tall, muscular, and carrying himself like a man who thought he had it all figured out. I stood in the doorway, watching as Rachel threw herself into his arms with a big smile on her face. It was like watching a bad movie unfold in slow motion. Rachel shouted, "I'll be right there!" Then she walked back inside to say goodbye to me. We stood there in awkward silence for a few seconds before I finally spoke. "If you're really going through with this, remember the rules. I don't want to see or hear from you for the entire year. Is that clear? And don't expect me to be waiting when you come back." Rachel's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded slowly. "I understand, David. But everything will be fine, you'll see. I'll come back, and things will be better than ever." I didn't respond. I just stared at her, waiting for her to leave. She reached out to touch my arm, but I stepped back. She tried to kiss me on the cheek, but I turned away. "I can't kiss you knowing you're about to walk out of here and go to him," I said flatly. Her face crumpled, and she ran out of the house, straight into Daniel's arms. They kissed passionately in front of our home, and something inside me snapped. I closed the door, walked back into the living room, and sank into the couch, feeling numb. That was the moment I realized I had truly lost her. The woman I had loved for nearly 3 decades was now someone else's, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I called into work that morning and told them I was sick. Then I drove straight to the hardware store, bought new locks, and spent the rest of the day changing them. I didn't want Rachel or Daniel coming back into my house anytime soon. The physical work of installing the locks distracted me from the emotional pain. But once I finished, the sadness returned like a tidal wave. I did what any man in my situation might do. I turned off the phone, grabbed a bottle of whiskey, and started drinking. I drank until I couldn't feel anything anymore, hoping that the alcohol would somehow numb the heartache. But no matter how much I drank, the pain stayed with me. By the time Sunday morning rolled around, I had run out of booze and was feeling like death itself, both physically and emotionally. I stumbled to bed, falling into a deep sleep, only to be awakened by a knock at the door. It took me a moment to realize where I was and what was happening. The pounding in my head from the hangover made it hard to focus, but I managed to get to the door. When I opened it, there stood Sophia, looking at me with a mixture of shock and concern. "Dad, what the hell is going on?" she asked, her eyes scanning the disarray of the house and the unmistakable smell of alcohol. I tried to pull myself together, but my brain was still foggy. "What do you mean?" I asked, though I knew exactly what she was referring to. She shook her head, stepping past me into the house. "You need food and coffee. Let's get you cleaned up first, then you can tell me what's going on." As she guided me into the kitchen, I started to feel the weight of the past few days crashing down on me. Once I had some food in my stomach and a strong cup of coffee in my hand, I finally broke down and told her everything. About Daniel, about her mother's so-called vacation, and about how I didn't think there was any way to save my marriage. Sophia listened quietly, her face a mixture of disbelief and sadness. When I finished, she finally spoke. "So, let me get this straight. Mom is leaving you for a year to rekindle her high school romance with Daniel?" I nodded, my heart heavy. "Yes, that's exactly what's happening." She stared at me in disbelief. "And what are you going to do, Dad?" I sighed, feeling the weight of the decision that lay ahead of me. "Tomorrow, I'm calling in sick again and going to see a lawyer." Sophia's face showed a mix of concern and disbelief as she tried to process everything I had just told her. "I can't believe Mom would do something like this. It just doesn't seem like her. Maybe she's having some kind of breakdown." I shook my head, feeling the exhaustion set in. "I don't know what's going through her head, Sophia. I really don't. But I know one thing. I can't sit around waiting for her to figure it out. I have to protect myself." She nodded slowly, her eyes filling with sadness. "I understand, Dad. I don't know what to say. I wish I could tell you to wait it out and see if she comes back to her senses. But maybe this is the best option." Sophia stayed with me for a few more hours that afternoon, making sure I was eating and taking care of myself. Before she left, she kissed me on the cheek and promised to check in on me more often. As she was heading out the door, she turned to me, her voice soft. "Dad, why did you call me over today? What happened?" I sighed, realizing that Sophia didn't know the full story yet. "Your mother called you. She didn't tell you why, but she wanted you to check on me." Sophia's eyes widened in surprise, and she shook her head. "Mom?" She didn't say anything when she called. I had no idea. I gave her a small, tired smile. "I think your mother knows what she's doing, even if she doesn't want to admit it." The next day, I kept my word. I called into work and made an appointment with a lawyer. Sitting in the office, I explained the situation to him. The lawyer listened carefully and gave me his advice. He confirmed what I had suspected. Since Rachel had left the marriage voluntarily, I had a strong case for divorce. I could potentially prevent her from getting half of my pension, though the other assets we'd accumulated over the years were still on the table. It was a relief to know that I had some control over the situation, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I was making progress. The lawyer suggested that I start liquidating certain assets during the year Rachel would be away. By the time she came back, if she came back, there wouldn't be much left for her to claim. The following weeks passed by quickly. I was surprised at how fast I adjusted to being alone. I started going to the gym more often, taking care of myself in ways I hadn't in years. On one hand, it was freeing to not have to worry about anyone else. On the other hand, waking up alone and going to bed alone was something I wasn't used to. I didn't hear from Rachel for months. The silence was both a blessing and a curse. Then, in mid-July, I received an unexpected phone call. It was Sophia, She'd just given birth to my first grandson. "Dad, he's here. He's perfect. You have to come see him." Her voice was full of joy, and for the first time in months, I felt a genuine smile spread across my face. I drove straight to the hospital to meet my new grandson. When I arrived, I found Sophia in her hospital bed, holding the tiny baby in her arms. I walked over and hugged her, looking down at the little boy she was cradling. "What's his name?" I asked, my voice soft. Sophia smiled up at me. "His name is Jack, after you, Dad." I felt a lump form in my throat. I had always been close to Sophia, but hearing that my grandson was named after me was an honor I hadn't expected. We spent the next hour talking, with me holding little Jack and marveling at how perfect he was. But as I sat there, I couldn't help but wonder if Rachel had been in touch with Sophia. The thought of Rachel coming back into my life, even for the birth of our grandson, made my stomach twist. I didn't have to wait long for the answer. As I was about to leave, Sophia spoke up. "Dad, there's something I need to tell you. Mom came by earlier today. She wants to be part of Jack's life. And she brought Daniel with her." I felt my blood run cold. "Daniel? She brought him here? To the hospital?" Sophia nodded, looking uncomfortable. "Yes, but they didn't stay long. Mom was so happy to see Jack, but I could tell it was awkward for her. She wants to be involved, Dad. She still cares about you, you know." I clenched my jaw, trying to keep my emotions in check. "Does she now?" "Well, I'm glad to hear she still cares. I don't want anything to do with Daniel, Sophia. You understand?" Sophia placed a hand on my arm, her voice gentle. "I understand, Dad. But please, for Jack's sake, can we all just try to get along?" I wanted to tell her no, to say that I couldn't be in the same room as Rachel and Daniel, but seeing the look in her eyes, I knew that wasn't an option. "I'll try, Sophia. For Jack, I'll try," I finally said. After leaving the hospital, my mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Seeing Sophia so happy with her new baby had brought me joy, but hearing about Rachel and Daniel being there had brought back all the anger and pain. I couldn't believe she had the nerve to show up with him, especially on such an important day for our family. The next few weeks were hard. I hadn't seen or heard from Rachel in months, but now, knowing she was back in town with Daniel, I was constantly on edge. I went to see Jack as often as I could, but I always made sure my visits didn't overlap with hers. I couldn't face her. Not yet. Then, one night, everything changed. It was a Saturday evening, and I had decided to go out for a drink at O'Hara's Tavern, a local spot in Chicago where I'd often gone to unwind. As I sat at the bar, nursing my whiskey, I suddenly heard laughter behind me. I turned around, and there they were, Rachel and Daniel, walking in together, hand in hand, acting like a couple of teenagers on a date. They didn't even notice me sitting there. I watched as they sat down at a table in the corner, oblivious to my presence. Rachel was smiling and laughing, hanging on Daniel's every word. He, of course, looked as smug as ever, as if he'd won some kind of prize. My stomach churned with anger and disgust, but I forced myself to stay calm. Then, as Rachel got up to use the restroom, she finally spotted me at the bar. Her face froze in shock for a moment, and then she gave me a small, hesitant smile before walking over. "David, I didn't expect to see you here," she said softly. I looked up at her, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hello, Rachel. Enjoying your evening?" She shifted uncomfortably. "I am. We're just, catching up." "Is that what you're calling it?" I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. She frowned, clearly hurt by my tone. "David, I know this is hard for you, but I really didn't want it to be this way." I raised an eyebrow. "Didn't you? Because from where I'm sitting it looks like you're enjoying yourself quite a bit." Rachel sighed, her eyes filled with regret. "I'm sorry, David. I didn't want to hurt you." Before I could respond, Daniel came striding over, his face twisted in anger. "What's going on here?" he demanded, glaring at me. "You bothering my woman?" I laughed bitterly. "Your woman? She's still my wife, Daniel. You're just borrowing her for the year. Daniel took a step closer, his fists clenched. You better watch your mouth, David. I don't like the way you're talking to her. My heart started pounding, but I didn't back down. You want to hit me, Daniel? Go ahead. But just remember, if you do, I'll press charges, and you'll be spending the rest of your year in jail. How's that for a romantic getaway? He hesitated, clearly weighing his options, and I could see the frustration in his eyes. Rachel stepped between us, trying to calm him down. Daniel, stop. This isn't worth it. He glared at me for a moment longer, then turned and stormed back to their table. Rachel gave me one last pleading look before following him. I sat back down, my hands shaking as I picked up my drink. That was the closest I'd ever come to a physical fight with Daniel. And part of me had wanted him to throw that punch. I wanted him to give me an excuse to hit back. But instead, I was left feeling hollow, like I had lost yet another battle. Later that night, as I drove home, I couldn't stop thinking about the way Rachel had looked at me. There was still something there, some part of her that regretted what she had done. But it didn't matter. She had made her choice, and I had to live with it. The next morning, I woke up with a new resolve. I couldn't keep living like this, waiting for Rachel to come to her senses. It was time to move on. I called my lawyer and told him to start preparing the divorce papers. It was a hard decision, but it felt like the only way forward. I couldn't be stuck in limbo anymore, waiting for Rachel to decide who she wanted to be with. I needed to take control of my life again. In the following weeks, I focused on getting my affairs in order. I started by contacting a private investigator to dig into Daniel's past. I wanted to know exactly who this man was and what kind of life he had led. I had a feeling there was more to his story than Rachel knew, and I was determined to find out. Meanwhile, I also spoke to my boss about transferring to the company's branch office in San Diego. I had always said I would never leave Chicago, but with everything that had happened, a fresh start in a new city sounded more appealing than ever. My boss said he would look into it and let me know. Thanksgiving was just around the corner, and Sophia had invited me to spend the holiday with her, Ethan, and the baby. Of course, she had also invited Rachel and Daniel, which made the decision for me. There was no way I was going to sit at the same table as them. Thanksgiving came and went without much fanfare. I spent the holiday alone, eating a microwave dinner in front of the TV, which was a far better alternative than sitting at the same table as Rachel and Daniel. Sophia called me afterward, trying to make me feel less guilty about not joining them. But I knew it had been hard on her too. She wanted her family together, but our family was no longer what it used to be. December rolled around, and it turned out to be a surprisingly productive month. My boss called me with good news. The transfer to the San Diego branch was approved, and I could start in January. The idea of leaving Chicago behind and starting fresh on the West Coast filled me with a sense of relief. For the first time in months, I felt like I was moving forward instead of being stuck in the past. Even better news came from the private investigator I had hired. The report on Daniel was far worse than I could have imagined. It turned out that he had been married 3 times, each marriage ending in divorce due to his infidelity. He had 2 children from women who were not his wives, and he was still paying child support for both of them. To top it off, his last divorce had cost him half of his military pension. The investigator even found that Daniel had been demoted from E8 to E6 during his final year in the Navy, for reasons that were murky at best. In short, Daniel wasn't the hero Rachel had made him out to be. He was a serial cheater with a string of broken relationships and financial problems. Armed with this information, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. Rachel needed to know the truth about the man she had thrown away her life for. But the best news of all came just before Christmas. My lawyer informed me that Rachel would be served with divorce papers on the first business day after the holidays. It was like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I had finally taken control of the situation, and I was ready to move on with my life. When I called Sophia to ask about the Christmas plans, she begged me to come over for dinner. I could tell she was hoping for some kind of reconciliation between Rachel and me, but I knew that wasn't possible. Still, for the sake of my daughter and my grandson, I agreed to be there. It would be the last family holiday I spent with them, and after that, I planned to cut all ties with Rachel for good. Christmas Day arrived, and I showed up at Sophia's house with a bag full of gifts for her, Ethan, and baby Jack. The moment I walked in, I could feel the tension in the air. Rachel and Daniel were already there, sitting on the couch with their arms around each other. Rachel looked up at me with a timid smile, but I ignored her. This wasn't about her or Daniel. This was about Sophia and her family. I gave Ethan a handshake and handed Sophia the presents I had brought. She smiled warmly and hugged me, clearly relieved that I had come. "Thanks for coming, Dad. It means a lot to me." I nodded, trying to focus on the positives. "Of course, Sophia. I'm here for you and the baby." Dinner was awkward, to say the least. Ethan tried to keep the conversation light, but it was clear that Rachel and I were avoiding eye contact. Daniel, ever the showman, took the opportunity to regale us with stories from his military career, playing up his role as the brave Navy man. Rachel listened to him with adoration in her eyes, but I couldn't help but feel disgusted by the whole act. After dinner, we gathered around the tree to open presents. Sophia handed out gifts to everyone, and when I opened mine, a tie, I couldn't help but chuckle at how cliché it was. "Thanks, Sophia," I said with a smile, even though the gift felt hollow compared to everything else going on. But then it was my turn. I stood up and grabbed the bag I had brought with me, pulling out a large envelope. "I have something special for you, Sophia and Ethan," I said, handing it to them. Sophia looked confused but tore open the envelope. As she read the papers inside, her eyes widened in shock. "Dad, you're giving us the house? For free? No mortgage?" I smiled at her, feeling a sense of pride in what I was doing. "Yes, it's all yours. Merry Christmas." Rachel's face went pale as she realized what was happening. She turned to me, her voice filled with concern. "David, where are we going to live? Why would you do this?" I looked at her coldly. "Don't worry, Rachel. I've thought of everything. Here, this is for you." I handed her a small box and a card. Inside the box was a bracelet, and when she pulled it out, I gestured for her to read the inscription. She flipped the bracelet over and read the words aloud. "Thank you for the best 29 years of my life." Rachel's eyes filled with tears as she looked back at me. "David, I don't understand. Why didn't you write 'with love'?" I smiled bitterly. "Because I didn't want to lie, Rachel. I've been losing my love for you little by little these past few months. This bracelet is my way of saying goodbye." She stared at me in disbelief as I continued. "You'll be served with divorce papers on Monday, and inside the card you'll find a check for half of our liquid assets. There's not much, about $210,000, but I've spent quite a bit while you've been gone. The house is mine to give away, and I've given it to Sophia. You forfeited your rights to it when you walked out on our marriage." Rachel's tears started to fall, but I wasn't done yet. I handed her another envelope. "This one is for you, too. It's a full report on everything your beloved Daniel has been up to since high school. I think you'll find it enlightening." Before Rachel could respond, Daniel jumped up from the couch, his face twisted with rage. "You son of a! I'll kill you!" he shouted, lunging toward me. But before he could get too close, I pulled out my stun gun and zapped him. He dropped to the floor with a painful groan, twitching as the electricity coursed through his body. Sophia screamed, and Rachel looked horrified, rushing over to Daniel. "David! What the hell are you doing?" she cried, kneeling beside him. I remained calm, keeping my distance but making sure Daniel wasn't getting back up anytime soon. "I told you, Rachel. I've had enough. This man has destroyed our marriage, and I'm not going to let him get away with it." I turned back to Sophia and Ethan, who were both frozen in shock. "I'm sorry you had to see this, but this has been coming for a long time." As Daniel struggled to his feet, still disoriented, Rachel turned to me, her voice shaking. "David, please. This isn't who you are." I laughed bitterly. "Isn't it? You threw away nearly 30 years of marriage for this guy, and now you expect me to just walk away quietly? No, Rachel. I'm done being the nice guy." Daniel finally managed to stand, though he was still clearly dazed. He glared at me with murderous intent but stayed silent, clearly thinking twice about coming at me again. Ethan, sensing the tension, gently stepped forward. Okay, I think we all need to take a breath here. This is supposed to be Christmas, remember? I took a deep breath and turned to Sophia, my expression softening. I didn't want to do this today, especially not in front of you. But your mother needs to understand what she's done. Sophia was still in shock, tears welling up in her eyes. Dad, I don't even know what to say. I sighed and turned back to Rachel, my voice cold once again. I hope you enjoy your new life with Daniel. He's not the man you think he is, and that envelope will prove it. But as far as I'm concerned, you're both out of my life. Rachel looked devastated, tears streaming down her face. David, please. I thought we could fix this. I thought I'd come back and everything would be okay. I shook my head. It's too late, Rachel. I've already moved on. You made your choice, and now you have to live with it. With that, I turned to Sophia and Ethan, my voice softening once more. I love you both. I hope you enjoy the house. Take care of it. And take care of Jack. I gave them a quick hug, avoiding eye contact with Rachel and Daniel as I made my way toward the door. As I was about to leave, I stopped and looked back one last time. Merry Christmas, everyone, I said, though there was no joy in my voice. Then, without another word, I walked out the door and into the cold December night. The air was crisp, and as I breathed it in, I felt a strange sense of freedom. The weight of the last few months had finally lifted off my shoulders. As I drove away, I couldn't help but think about everything that had happened. In just a few short months, my entire life had been turned upside down. But as painful as it had been, I knew I had made the right choice. I had no idea what the future held, but I was ready for it. I had my transfer to San Diego, a fresh start waiting for me on the West Coast, and a newfound sense of independence. Rachel was no longer my concern. I could finally move on with my life. As I drove further into the night, I thought about stopping in Las Vegas on my way to San Diego. Maybe I'd see Samantha again. After all, I deserved a little fun after everything I'd been through. I smiled to myself as I sped down the highway, leaving the past behind me.